And so Professor Dr. Jocelyn Linnekin has offered to come here today and to talk specifically about her experiences in Latin America. So thank you, Jocelyn.
If any of you are wondering and or sort of thinking stinky things because I haven't been to Rabbi Shapiro's talks, I work in Stores, Connecticut, and in September and October it is heavy work time for the College Curriculum Committee, which meets on Tuesday afternoons, and which I am a member of. So that was a bummer. So we had to sort of fool around with this date so I could come. And I can't come next week, but I can come for Pam Mott's talk. Well, I hope you're not disappointed, because whenever I read the things about what I was going to talk about in the bulletin, they got a little intimidating. First, there was first of all, the first bulletin said I was going to talk about the future of the church in Latin America, and I immediately emailed Migdalia and said, "No, you can change that." I'm like, what do I know? What am I going to talk about that? I can't talk about that. And I'm also not going to attempt a history of religious changes in Latin America in recent decades. You can ask Mike about that. And I'm also not even going to attempt to explain the rise of evangelical and Pentecostal Protestantism. I'll just say it's happening. Why it's happening? Well, I brought some show and tell stuff in case I had death by computer. And I just brought some books if you wanted to see some. This is as much as I could carry from my office. Prayer Warriors, the new churches in Peru about evangelical and about Pentecostal denominations. It's happening all over Latin America. City of God Christian Citizenship in Post-War Guatemala. I did teach a course on religion and political change in Latin America. This is a classic Philip Berriman's Religion in the Mega City, because most of these Pentecostal and evangelical new churches are happening in the mega cities like Rio, Caracas, Lima, and we'll see in a second why they're mega cities. And this one, Tongues of Fire, the Explosion of Protestantism in Latin America, and Bautizados en Fuego, Protestants, discourses of conversion and politics in Guatemala. What I usually say when students come into my office and say, "Wow, you have a lot of books," I say, "I've read some of them." So that's kind of, I haven't read all of those. This one is Who Killed the Bishop? The Autopsy of a Political Crime, which I will allude to in a second. So what I really am going to talk about is something I've been worried about, and that is the future of the church of the Episcopal Church in the United States. I'm not really going to talk about that, but I've worried about it for many years. I think it's very sad because I love the church so much and I think it has so much to offer. But I don't think that we're going to, we have to, I think, me and my tapeworm, but the church has to kind of rethink things, because as it is, we're not going to attract enough people to replace the current demographic, which is majority white, financially secure, older people. And I just don't see, financially speaking, I don't see a whole new generation of Rockefellers and Vanderbilts on the horizon. It's not the good old days anymore. I just don't see that likely to happen. So the Episcopal Church is declining. Remember the disastrous decade of evangelism? No? Yeah, it was a real bomb. That one bombed. Because of secularism on the one hand, and because of the mushrooming of evangelical Protestant churches on the other hand. So I keep worrying, who will be our future parishioners? How does the church, I don't think the church is going to die, but the more likely scenario is that in 30 years it has to merge with the Lutherans, that is to say the ELCA, not the Missouri Synod. And I thought about Latin America. I'm going to be opinionated. I thought about Latin America and what I saw in Latin America, because I think the Latin American Episcopal churches have some lessons for us, that they offer some models that, that maybe we could learn from in the United States. So all I'm going to do is talk about my non-random, impressionistic, anecdotal observations of Episcopal church activities in a few Latin American locations. And maybe then afterwards we could have a discussion about mission and money, because I really think that's where we end up. So I'm a professor of anthropology, cultural anthropology, living societies, not dead ones, at the University of Connecticut. And between 1999 and 2004, I made a number of research trips to Latin America, several times to the Dominican Republic. I spent a month in Lima, Peru. I spent a month in Caracas during the early years of the Chavez regime. I also spent a month in Dakar, Senegal, because I wanted to get some comparative data from outside Latin America. And the longest single stretch was a semester in Guatemala. I had a Fulbright, and I spent 4 months traveling around Guatemala. The project was about local perceptions of democracy. Little did I know how timely this might come to be. And the research questions were, what does democracy mean to people in countries with a history of dictatorship? Whatever you want to call them, post-authoritarian regimes, transitional democracies. What do people in these countries identify as democratic values? What are the core values of democracy? And what do they personally want out of democracy? And I have to say, this wasn't a project about religion, so this isn't, this isn't research results about a study of religion. But I was talking to people about politics, and you can't separate religion from politics in Latin America, although it's rather subtle and nuanced. Religious affiliation, to some extent as it is here, is generally, as I saw it, an index of class, social status, aspirations, and political leaning, which I'll say more about in a second. The Roman Catholic Church is, of course, the historically dominant church in Latin America. It's still the largest denomination. And just a couple of historical notes. In the 1970s, liberation theology arose within the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America. It had its origins in Latin America. The signature call of liberation theology was a preferential option for the poor. That's another talk, maybe. Well, to make a long story short, the Roman Catholic hierarchy in Latin America mostly saw this as too leftist, and they thought it was close to communism, communists. And so it was suppressed by the Vatican when, guess who was the master of the office of the doctrine of the protection of the faith?
Yeah, Ratzinger.
Yes, exactly. So liberation theology was suppressed by the Vatican, and that's a complicated history that one can't really talk about, without a whole long time. In Latin America, the Episcopal Church is a bit player. It's a very small church, kind of like it is here. It operates under the radar, which actually I kind of think has its advantages in Latin America. But what impressed me is I always wanted to find an Episcopal church to go to on Sunday. And in case you don't know, the Latin American churches are all part of the American Episcopal Church. They are provinces. They are members of provinces within the American Episcopal Church. So this is our church. This is the American in the correct sense. It is the American Episcopal Church. And what really struck me and what I was so proud of was that I found Episcopal churches and clergy and lay people doing work where the poor live. What I thought was really walking the gospel talk. And I did not see Roman Catholic and Pentecostal churches doing that kind of work. So I was doing my research during the week, but I also always had this little side interest. I wanted to find out, what is the church, what is the Episcopal Church doing in these countries where 80 to 85% of the population is poor? And there was a personal, angle to this because I tried to become a priest in the Diocese of Connecticut, and the evolution of that was that I felt very strongly called to urban Hispanic ministry. And the more I went to Latin America for my job, the more passionate I became about that. So all those, they were research trips, and yes, it was professional research, but for me it also felt like a spiritual search. It was an inquiry, it was a pilgrimage of sorts. So I did lead 2 mission trips to the DR, the Dominican Republic, and for a month, before the Bishop of Connecticut sent me packing, I was in the Dominican Republic for a month, and kind of as an apprentice to the first woman priest ordained in the Diocese of the Dominican Republic. And by the way, that parish was San Esteban in San Pedro de Macorís, where, interestingly, this church just sent a mission group. And I'm putting this up here. I am going to get to Caracas in just a second. This is a picture of a mega city, one of these large cities in Latin America that grew and grew and grew with people with their hands scavenging materials, buying whatever materials little by little they could. That's all that red stuff. I'll say something about that in a sec. These cities grew through immigrants from the countryside. And this has been going on since the 1950s. The exodus from rural Latin America to the cities. And the cities have grown, and they have grown with impoverished people from the rural areas. And that's all part of a whole global economic upheaval. But we'll just say that that's what's happening. And let me just say one thing about, here's the punchline to my research findings. What I found was that the ideas about democracy, and especially what people wanted from democracy, didn't vary much from country to country. The axis of difference in every country was economic class. The poor people in Guatemala, the people in Guale and Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, the poor people of Lima, of all these places, said very much the same things. And the rich people said very much the same things. So that was really a major finding. And you can guess, this is probably going to sound familiar, the rich people, and I'm not talking about the intellectual class, I'm not talking about the journalists and the political liberals, who are elite also, but that's a different sort of an elite. The rich people wanted security for their property. They wanted law and order. They wanted the freedom to conduct their business. You may recognize the name of the infamous dictator Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Trujillo was a monster, and I remember sitting in the home of a kind of old, we call it old money, I guess, a woman who represented old money, and she said, "Malo, malo, malo hombre, malo, he was a bad man, bad man, bad man." And then there was a pause, and she said, "But the streets were clean, and there was less delinquencia, there was less delinquency." And, And I refer to that as totalitarian nostalgia. That yearning for recognizing that the dictator was a monster. But things were tidy and clean, and the buses ran, and my home was safe. Nobody got into my yard, that sort of thing. And what poor people said they wanted from democracy broke my heart over and over again. Imagine what are the benefits you want from a democratic system, and having somebody say to you, un techo, a roof, comida, food, education for the kids, servicios básicos, basic services, la canasta básica, that's the idea of a basic food basket of what the family would need, and medical services. So the implication there is you realize these people who are saying that don't have those things, and they saw democracy as holding out the hope, really, for a better life, or what the UN calls universal human rights. Which is a whole other issue, and I won't talk about that. But the point is this about poverty. And whenever I came home from a research trip, the anthropologists hang out with poor people. You know, we do that. We're out in very poor places. I don't hang out with elites. Every time I went to a Latin American country, I thought I had seen the worst poverty I had ever seen in my life or ever could see, and then I'd go to the next country, and I'd see something even worse. And I'd get home, and the miracle to me, the culture shock was always coming home. That's an axiom among anthropologists. Your real culture shock is when you get home. And you walk into the kitchen, and I always have that moment when I turn on the water. That water comes out, not in a trickle, but with really good pressure, and I can drink that water out of the tap. And I can even have it hot out of the tap. And to me, that's the most humbling moment, is when I go to the sink for the first time. And I think the gospel challenge to us confronts us in that miracle of water piped into your own home, and even hot water. So, what are some of the things that the church is doing in Latin America? I just put this, I hope I can do this. Okay. This is pretty much just what I said, that Caracas is one of these cities that grew and grew and grew. Caracas is in a valley, and you see that the hillsides got built up. There's no way where to go but up. And so the poor people who come in, it's squatters' houses basically, and they build the houses literally on top of each other by themselves with this terracotta bloque. I mean, these are homes that people just make by themselves. And those hillsides, this isn't even one of the steeper ones either, they look like a house of cards. They do, they absolutely do. And you may have heard about mudslides. This whole thing, when it starts to go down, that whole thing will go down. Because this is stuff that you and I mean, how are you at building a house? What if you somehow manage to cobble together some scavenged materials and the ever-present bloque, the terracotta blocks, and sometimes people have to go through other people's houses to get to their own houses. There was one that they had to go through 3 houses to get, but they were related, which is anthropologically interesting. But it's not like you even have separate entrances. These are literally on top of each other. And by the way, you'll see at the bottom, corruption has ended. The comandante, the commander has arrived, referring to Chavez. Chavez, made his career by appealing to the poor, and it is still the poor who support the very poor, some of them anyway, who support the Maduro regime. And it says, civic military Bolivarian project. So this is one of those, everything was after Simon Bolivar. There were Bolivarian circles, there still are. Everything is it's now called, Venezuela is the República Bolivariana, the Bolivarian Republic. But this just to see how the city grew. And Chavez appealed to leftist figures and leftist philosophy. But look at the houses right above the wall, and they just are all. And this isn't just Caracas, of course. This is in Brazil, the favelas look like this. In Lima, they're called pueblos jóvenes, which means the young towns. And there are they're like rabbit warrens, these things. The high rises are, one of our researchers, my research assistant, Francisco, who I found out later had been charged with the mission of making sure that I didn't go into any place too dangerous. Apparently his grandmother, he was like, I didn't realize he was like supposedly my shepherd through this. I only went into the sort of safe barrios, not the real bad ones. So there are apartments for the poor, and the garbage is thrown out and it goes down chutes just down to the ground and back of the building. Oh, and this is, get a load of the way these things are being built out. Look at the one on the right. It's been built out over the pathway, and you can see on the left, this is a main drag. That one on the left, that is a main drag. Okay, that's enough of Caracas. Let me give you two little anecdotes. I'm going to go out of that, and I'm going to go to... I wanted to find the Episcopal Cathedral in Caracas, which at the time was not the disaster that it is right now, although it wasn't real great. And so I must have been searching on the web. And this is Lima. And I found an online picture of a big classic stone cathedral in an upper-class neighborhood, and the contact name was an Anglo man. Honky Blanco, Hake Hapalangi, that's what honky means in different languages. And then there was an address for a Sunday service that was somewhere totally different. So I went to that address, which turned out to be the modest home of the Bishop of Venezuela. And the Sunday Eucharist had about 5 or 6 people and was held in his carport. So, I was baffled. Well, see if this sounds familiar. The story was that a group of parishioners at the cathedral had taken possession of the physical cathedral over doctrinal disagreements. Somehow I deduced that these parishioners were mostly well-off, upper class, maybe some U.S. expats, and white. The Bishop of Venezuela was a dark-skinned, indigenous-looking man. Guerrero, I think. I interviewed him. The bishop was barred from the cathedral, and there was a legal fight going on. Sound familiar, huh?
Yes, it does.
And the bishop was reduced to...
Wait, that's not going to happen here, right?
Like our bishop. I think that battle's won here,
Okay.
or it's water under the bridge. So the bishop, who did not seem very happy about anything at the time, was reduced to holding Sunday Eucharist in his carport. And actually, he really seemed kind of depressed, and he wasn't really in in contact with the national church. So I like to think that I encouraged him, and I said he was really kind of downcast, and shortly thereafter they did have him start more communications with the national church. And I really haven't done the research to find out what happened. But then there was a totally different experience in Caracas. I forget who took me, he referred me to somebody. I attended a very lovely service up in one of those barrios, in a very tidy, beautiful little church with a little square in front of it, which was in itself remarkable because you don't see those little open spaces at all in these barrios. So it was just lovely, and I kind of reflected upon, so I bet you the bishop didn't tell this priest to do this. I mean, I didn't have the feeling that there was a lot of central control. So how do these things happen? Well, they come from somebody's recognition of a need and somebody's willingness and commitment to do something. We had a lovely service, and there weren't that many people. We were very cautious leaving and sort of looked outside, because I had been informed that sometimes when they're having services there are gunshots outside, drug fights and stuff like that, which is, par for the barrios, and it's much worse in Caracas now. So in Lima, the poor areas, the squatter neighborhoods that are growing, are called pueblos jóvenes, which means young towns. I met a wonderful clergyman in Lima at the Episcopal Cathedral, Bishop William Godfrey. The cathedral itself in Lima is your classic, beautiful stone, Gothic-style Episcopal cathedral, and of course, an upper-class neighborhood. When I went to a service there weren't many people. There were some U.S. expats, and there were some upper-class Venezuelans. The Episcopal Church, at least those big cathedrals, the big fancy ones, tend to attract upper-class local people. So, and why is that? Well, well-off people like to go to the Episcopal Church in Lima, perhaps because they stay equated with modernity, with sophistication, with the U.S. and all the superiority that the U.S. Symbolizes. I always noticed how well-dressed the women were. But Bishop Godfrey was very passionate about mission and doing what Christians are supposed to do and living the gospel, enacting the gospel message. So he took me on a long drive through the Pueblos Jóvenes of Lima, and he wanted to show me the outposts of the church in some of these places. He was very enthusiastic about it. And in our conversations, at one point he mentioned with some embarrassment, and I had not said a whisper about me. He mentioned that the southern Cone province, to which Peru belongs, was very conservative and didn't ordain women. And I hadn't said anything, but he sort of felt, I guess, that as an American woman, I might wonder about that. So this is how the squatter town in Lima begins. Lima is actually a desert, and pretty much outside of, away from the coast. It's on the coast, but this was in the Lima's winter. There was the Peruvian winter, and there's this kind of constant overcast, humid mist called the garua. And you never see the sun, which is why the sky just looks overcast like this. This is how these things grow. Notice that these are hills. These are barren desert hills on the outskirts of Lima, and the choza means stop doing that. the choza is a shack, and the first dwellings that the incomers from the country build are these shacks made out of whatever they can find. But they also, as you can see on the right, by hand, they dig out terraces in the hill and they shore it up with rocks. So they terrace the hills with their own hands and hand tools, and they shore up the terrace so they can build someplace to build the houses, and they shore these things up with rocks. So speaking of like poverty, you know, this was close to the worst, getting at the time to the worst thing I'd ever seen. And the later comers have to go higher and higher up the hill. And these, as it says, the caption says, this was about a year or two old settlement. And you can just see the hodgepodge of materials that the houses are built with. And it's all hand, the whole hill was like excavated, it's like biblical times, I suppose, the pyramids, it was all excavated by hand. And my question there is, can you find the latrines? And now I'm sort of looking for the latrines. You have to go up close, but you can find latrines. And by the way, there are blue water bottles, your familiar blue water barrel there, because there was no water here yet.
Is that what that whole row of blue is up
Yeah,
there?
blue barrels, and there are people who they pay, you know, you buy water from a guy who comes around in a cart. And in the Dominican Republic, I saw that in rural Dominican Republic, and it's a mule pulling a cart with water, and they pay per barrel, or if they can't afford a full barrel, they'll share with a neighbor half a barrel.
And is that rainwater? Is that where they get it from, or where do they?
Well, it was, I don't know where, you were in Peru, I don't know where ultimately the water.
It has to come from wells, because there is no rain at all, ever.
Just the
In Lima,
Right.
there's no rain.
Right,
It's a desert.
that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see that from the landscape. I mean, there's not a blade of grass in the uncolonized land. And this was again with Bishop Godfrey. He was showing me these places. There's a shack, a choza on the top, the very top there, if you can call that a shack. And the privy is over there on the right. Now, what's interesting about this is that Lima had run an electric line up there. But now none of these people have any legal rights to this land. It just grew. And here's one of the remarkable places, just below that latrine. Just below that latrine, on a carved out terrace, was a new chapel. The Anglican Church of Peru, Mission San Pedro. The walls are made of matting called esteras. And this is Bishop Godfrey, who's English, with the woman who was the caretaker for this. So this was both a chapel and a feeding center and a gathering place. And inside the floor was dirt, and there were wooden benches. And that woman by herself serves a hot lunch to 100 to 150 children each day.
Oh, wow.
Where does the food come from if there's no rain and they can't grow food?
Well, they buy it. I mean, Lima has plenty of food. It just comes in. Note there's a house above them on the upper right, and that was for sale at the time. And notice how it has a picture window. But this was just one of the things that it just blew me away. This was very far from Miraflores, where the, espresso places and the intellectuals are.
And did many people come to the church?
I don't remember, I didn't ask about the congregation, but one thing they said was that there were some children who came regularly. They were regulars among the children, but sometimes a child or a person would show up and they'd never see them again. So these favelas, barrios, pueblos jóvenes, especially with the very new parts of them, this is la pobreza extrema. This is extreme poverty. This is just, again, this is the on one side of that line, the town is growing. And this is kind of the progression. This is what happens. You see it fills in. The city puts in lights. But notice it's all dirt and it's a lot of found scavenged materials. And people start little entrepreneurial enterprises. This woman was basically selling fast food, street food, in one of these places. And there's a very dramatic contrast between an area that's not colonized, and you can see how dry it is, and you can see how much it's filled in. And look, it's starting to look like a city with houses of bloque and windows and little buses. So this is how these things grow. And this was near I think I took this from where the chapel is. In anthropology, when we interview people, we try to categorize them by social economic class and whatever else is significant at the time to our project. And there are measures of SES, or socioeconomic status. Well, of course, those measures have to be defined in the context of where you happen to be. And one of the questions we would ask, I'd do an interview, and at the end I'd ask some questions to sort of try to peg them, see where they were economically. And one of the really important questions was, what kind of a latrine do you have? Do you have an indoor toilet? Do you have a flush toilet? Do you have an outside privy? And the worst one was when people on these hills, especially the ones at the very top, they said a hueco. They had a hole in the rocks. That was their latrine. So I found Bishop Godfrey and what they were doing in Peru. And there's your classic mega city, barrio, new town, favela, the bloque. Not as built up on top of each other as in Caracas, because Lima is flat and you can spread out. And that's pretty horrific. I don't know, that one, these got me. These are the newer, meaning a year or two old settlements. It's just a progression of how they eventually become not shanty towns full of shacks, but okay, there we go. And these are terrible because they were taken inside and it was really bright yellow on the walls. But let me see if I got this. Oh, there we go. You can see that this is one of the older barrios by the buildings in the background in Lima. This is in a more developed part of Lima, but still a very poor neighborhood. And this was another project. This is a community center and a child care center. And this is Bishop Godfrey and his ayudante, his assistant. And this was for poor kids. But you can see what they tried to provide for them. And these are the ladies who were the caretakers. So this is the Dominican Republic. This is San Pedro de Macorís. And I showed you this picture of the water tank. By the way, around the corner around the side of the water tank, there's a spigot, and guys with mule-drawn carts come up and they fill barrels with water, and they take the water and sell it to people who don't have running water. And so But the reason I showed you this is because it says, Christ loves you, look for him, his coming is near. So, and then it says, Jesus said, come to me, all of you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And it says, visit the congregation, the Christian congregation, water for those who thirst. Is that what that says?
I can't read that last word.
It says,
from here.
para los sedientos.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's take this. Yeah.
Water for the thirsty. So the name of the Christian congregation, water for the thirsty. But this is classic storefront evangelical kind of church. And the Dominican Republic has them too.
And of course, if the church was around the corner from a bakery, it would be Pan de Vida.
I just thank you, Michael. And so I spent a lot of time in San Pedro de Macorís, and I found the work of Madre Mercedes Julián de Rivera, the priest there, to be inspiring. There's kind of an outpost in San Pedro de Macorís of the Episcopal Church and an order of nuns, the Community of the Transfiguration in Cincinnati. They run a clinic, Centro de Salud, a clinic and a child feeding center and a child care center in a poorer neighborhood that I'll show you in a second. But this is the San Esteban Episcopal Church in San Pedro de Macorís. And what they do there is really, I think, quite remarkable. And this is where the sidewalk ends. San Pedro de Macorís is a gritty post-industrial town that never got the tourist dollars and the tourist boom because, I was told, they were a kind of anti-Trujillo town. So under the dictator Trujillo, the money for infrastructure development and tourist facility development went to other places. And San Pedro de Macorís does have some pretty nice houses, but it also has these barrios where the sidewalk ends. So I went along with Madre Mercedes into the barrio because that's where the health center was. This is right near as a matter of fact, that's it, right over there in the back right. But you can see this is the water in the streets, garbage. Kids don't have shoes. That's Madre Mercedes. A friend of mine trusted me with the care of her teenage son. She went down with me that month, and we had a blast in a tragic and moving way, but it was a wonderful trip. But so we went on with her on home visits into the barrio. And man, one thing the third world has taught me is I can't stand wearing open-toed shoes in cities. I really have a thing about wearing sandals, especially in cities, but what's in those streets and in that water? I mean, literally there are dead animals around and stuff like that. On the other hand, this is how the other half lives. So there are the rich and then there are the poor, and these are some of the kids by the health center. I was told that when they opened that center, malnutrition was very high in the barrio around it, and they started feeding the kids hard-boiled eggs. That's the go-to thing. And when I was there, they said that malnutrition had become so reduced that it really wasn't a problem anymore, and they were going to do more enrichment kinds of things. And wow. And these Dominican kids, many of these kids are of Haitian descent. They're so much fun, and they are so delightful. And Michael, my companion, and I, we did vacation Bible school classes to Haitian 3- and 4-year-olds. Well, this is, you notice the sign? The Episcopal Church welcomes you in this barrio, and it says Chapel of the Transfiguration, Medical Center, Buen Pastor, or Good Shepherd, the Good Shepherd Medical Clinic. And these are some of the families. And that was the nun, that was one of the nuns, I believe that's Sister Jean in the back.
Yes.
Anglican.
Anglican nuns?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Jocelyn, the question just looking at this, right, with the Episcopal Church there, so.
Well,
how
this
it-
wasn't the church.
It's the health center.
This was the branch, yeah.
Right, but my question is, who's funding these experiences? Is this the
Oh.
rich people that live there
No,
are
no,
funding
no.
local,
Oh,
or is
no,
this
no, no.
coming from
This-
everywhere
The
else?
ministries at San Pedro de Macorís are heavily funded by American donors.
So it's not
Very much
locally
so.
funded through the local Episcopal Church?
Very little. I mean, certainly there's the Diocese of the Dominican Republic, but they depend on American donations big time, big time. I mean, I led a mission group. I led two. There are mission groups coming down there all the time. And when the Americans come, they paint, they do the painting, they do the work. Once I did was doing Rube Goldberg carpentry, and I learned what you say when you need spackle at a hardware store. And I also learned there's only one color paint available. That's why everything is kind of this green, because that's the only color. Anyway, heavily, they bring money and they bring stuff. They bring backpacks. We would bring backpacks with all kinds of stuff, from toiletries to baseballs, to toys for the kids, because these kids have nothing materially. So this is this nun was really a tough cookie, and that's her with Michael. My companion, who was remarkably mature, and this is the sign, the Episcopal College San Esteban. The more upper, or middle and upper class residents of San Pedro de Macorís find this school to be very desirable, and it's a prestige thing. So they do get full tuition from the better off families, but they also offer a lot of scholarships. That's a classroom of little kids, but you can see these kids are happy and well fed, and it's just it's a wonderful place, and the staff are wonderful, and kids get fed, and there's a lot of school spirit.
Does that go through the 12th grade?
Yes, yeah. And there was we had a graduation, they had a graduation once when I was there. And there's also summer school. They have summer school for the kids in the barrio, and this is where a lot of Americans come and help out, which is where we helped out. And this is the classroom with me and Michael and these kids. And I made the mistake of saying we could act out the parable of the Buen Samaritano, the Good Samaritan. And Michael got to play the role of the guy who was beaten and left in the road. And those kids really got into it. And so, anyway, they were very enthusiastic students. I mean, we really had a good time. They're kind of, they're a little wild, but hey. Notice that the physical plant, even though this is a relatively prestigious school, the physical plant is,
Basic.
yeah, right, well, that's what you got. And yeah, I put in a picture of me. And this is another place in the Dominican Republic.
Was that you?
Yeah.
Turn it back.
I'm glad you told me it was you.
Yeah. I was chalice bearer, and I led Bible study in Spanish.
Oh, cool.
The scariest moment, which has nothing to do with this talk, is that there was a funeral, and the dead person's family came, and they were, I don't know whether they were not religious at all, but they were a bunch of they were not in a good mood, and it wasn't just because it was a funeral. They sat stony-faced in the church. Almost none of them came up for communion, even though Madre Mercedes made the invitation. But she had me do a reading from Romans, and she gave me this little card on what it was. I said, okay. So she basically gave me the entire Romans chapter 8 to read in Spanish in this hot church with these people sitting there. And I kept sort of looking at the card thinking, she can't make me just read all whole thing, look, I'm sweating, getting red-faced, and those people are just... That was, I still remember that. And you know, I asked her later, she said, yeah. I mean, they didn't want to be there. Anyway, so this is a different place in the Dominican Republic, and this is not the Episcopal Church, but it's what a church can do that reaches out to people where they are. This is up in the Central Valley of the Northern Dominican Republic, the Cibao. This is, that's a cinder block factory. It's like one little room. These women are a business cooperative. The big Roman Catholic Church in Santiago de los Caballeros, which is the main city of the Northern Valley. The big church is called La Virgen de la Alta Gracia, and a lot of Dominican women are called Alta Gracia. In the bottom of the church, the basement, there's a women's council office, and they give courses to women. They offer courses on democracy, on entrepreneurship, on accounting, and running a business. In other words, they're giving all these women's empowerment courses. These women are so empowered, you just want, you know, they blow you away. So these women had all taken the course on setting up a business, and with the eager help of their husbands, I mean, this is a good business, the husbands built the cinder block taller, the little factory. They make natural hair products, which they sell, productos naturales for the hair. And they are very well coiffed and very happy and very confident, and they made me feel very inferior with my frizzy hair. Dominicans will say they have malo cabello. Oh, we have bad hair. You know what that expression is. We hear that in this country. Bad hair, bad hair. So they really know how to clamp down their hair, and they did do a number on me. But look at these women. They're just fantastic group of women, but the church helped to empower them. This is the Roman Catholic Church. And there they had greased and slicked my hair down, so they did a nice job.
Are you the one in the middle?
Yeah. Wow. But look at them. I mean, they had great hair. I mean, even the woman in the black dress. I mean, she's quite old, but wow. I mean, and they were making money off of this. But what was exciting to me was that that's what a church can do. And when I interviewed the director of the women's group in the basement of this big Catholic church, one of the things she said was, she pointed upward and she said, they, the men, run the church, but we uphold it. And lastly, to turn to Guatemala. By the way, I brought some show and tell things from Guatemala. This weird skirt is from Coban, which is in the Central Highlands. They call it a corte, and all of the Maya indigenous women in Coban, this is the style in Coban. It's not really the style in the Western Highlands, but I just loved it. And I never get to wear it because in this country people just think you're weird. I have one other. What's interesting about this is that it's a heavy cotton, and it's a certain regulated kind of length. I think it's 8 meters, so it's like 24 feet of fabric maybe. I might have that number wrong. It's really heavy. It is really a freaking heck of a lot of fabric. And then what you do is you have it made. There are all these Maya market stalls, and you pick out the fabric. It's all open air, and you pick out the cordon, the cord, and they'll sew it up for you, and they'll make it for you. And they just got these guys, they got a real kick out of this Anglo woman wanting these cortes. This doesn't show so well, and Guatemala es dolor. That is what a woman said to me. Guatemala is pain and grief. I was in Guatemala for 4 months. I was mostly in the highlands, which is majority indigenous, that is to say Maya, The Guatemalan Maya are contiguous with the Maya of Yucatan, the general indigenous people are generically Maya. There are 23 different languages. About half of the national population of Guatemala is indigenous. It's a beautiful, culturally rich country that's haunted by the 36-year-long civil war, which is widely considered genocidal for the targeting of Maya. It was a Vietnam-like standoff between a leftist guerrilla force in the highlands and the government. Most of the government people and the upper class people self-identify as Ladino, meaning Hispanic descendant. This is not a biological term, this is an identity term. Indigena means the natives, the Maya. So there's a real social, ethnic cleavage there. And it is the Indigena, the indigenous people who were targeted during this horrendous war. I have a whole library about that. The war was carried out largely in the highlands. Coban, where I got this, was the scene of one major massacre. There were massacres all over the highlands. Entire villages burned to the ground. It's estimated that about 250,000, mostly Maya people, were killed by the army, and local civilian patrols, militias, vigilantes. Those were the Ladino guys. Those were not indigenous people. And the pretext was that the government accused indigenous villages of sheltering the guerrillas. Right-wing death squads, untold numbers of people who were disappeared. They're called desaparecidos in Latin America. This is a set of columns that is in front of the Catholic Cathedral in the major square of Guatemala City, the capital. And it says, executed victims, victims of massacres, the disappeared, people who disappeared, victims tortured in alphabetical order. Look in each of these categories for the name that you want to find. It is a wall of the dead and the disappeared. And the names of the most affected communities are in the upper part of each column, so they're by community and then by name in alphabetical order. And it says, the Office of Human Rights of the Archbishop of Guatemala, Interdiocesan Project for the Recuperation of Historical Memory, or REMI. And this was one of the two major fact-finding reports that told the truth about the war. About 500,000 Maya were displaced, were forced to leave their homes, and I took pictures of these columns. This one says, victims of massacres in Quiché district, and then there's I can't really even see it, but it's the names of the towns. And Quiché, these are the names of victims of massacres. By the way, they, to this day, they keep finding and exhuming mass graves in Guatemala. The country was and still is peppered with mass graves because all those disappeared people, many of them were buried in like 3, 4, 5 people in a hole in the forest, so they keep finding them. This one says...
Doctor, what were the years of the war?
The peace accord was in 1996, so 36 years. The worst years were probably the early 1980s. This one is the executed, and it has on top Huehuetenango, which is the name of the town, and then there are the villages within Huehue. So there's the larger settlement name, and then the names of the villages, and then these are those who were executed. Now, the role of the Roman Catholic Church in the war is controversial, and the thing about this is that you can't really, in Guatemala it's very mixed up. There were clergy, Roman Catholic clergy high in the hierarchy, who were basically in league with the government, with the right-wing government. On the other hand, many of the Roman Catholic priests were on the side of the indigenous people. So it's not like you can easily say they're all this or they're all that. The military was assassinating Roman Catholic priests in the indigenous villages in the highlands. And so the bishop, Juan Gerardi, withdrew them from the villages. He called them back, which created quite a controversy at the time, because he was calling attention to the fact that the priests were getting to the massacres. I mean, he was dedicated to the truth. Now here's an interesting religious angle. The president during the worst times of the massacres, the early 80s, was Efraín Rios Montt, who was an evangelical Christian. And I was told that a lot of people converted to evangelical Christianity because of him. So interestingly, you get this political / religious, sort of correlation there, and it's not perfect. And by the way, Rios Montt was finally prosecuted for war crimes just in the past few years. But he was convicted and it was overturned, and I can't remember whether it was a technicality or because he's just so old. But he's a vampire. Anyway, but here's what happened. So Bishop Juan Gerardi was a champion of the truth. Oh, this is the tortured columns and columns and columns. And this is what the names look like up close. And these are all the columns in front of the Roman Catholic diocesan cathedral. Oh, where is justice? And on that same wall are these paper posters. The faces, desaparecido, disappeared. These are the faces of disappeared, mostly young men. Where are they? Where are they? And that whole wall is these posters of the disappeared. There are pictures of Maya women carrying pictures like this. Old Maya women, like 30 years after the sun disappeared, and they're carrying this picture with them still. And I went on the first peace march in a long time in Guatemala City. It was a huge peace march, and one thing about Guatemala is that people are at least emboldened to go into the streets now, although the indigenous Maya less so. They still act like they're afraid, with good reason. So this says, enough already, enough of this violence, and here's, it is even worse now. It is an extraordinarily violent, crime-ridden country. There were hundreds of never solved gruesome murders of women in particular when I was there. What am I doing? And this was a huge demonstration in front of the Palacio, the big government building, and it says, enough already. Ya basta. Enough of so much violence. I love these pictures, and they gave out headbands that says, enough already, and I've got another one, I can't remember. No más delincuencia. Delincuencia doesn't mean juvenile delinquency. No more crime. This was a very well-spirited, positive march contra la violencia and for life, against violence and for life. One of my good shepherd in Guatemala was a graduate student of mine who, after the march, told me, "Oh, this is the first march in a long time that didn't break up in violence." Okay. To finish that point I started to make about this book, Who Killed the Bishop? Bishop Juan Gerardi was led the investigation that produced the Remy report. It is an unstinting graphic account of all the atrocities and the massacres with first-person testimony. Shortly before the peace accords were signed, he was murdered brutally in the carport of his residence in the city of Guatemala, right around the corner from where an outspoken female journalist, Myrna Mack, had been hacked to death with machetes. Right-wing death squads. Bishop Girardi was bludgeoned with a concrete block in the face and head. So this is Guatemala, but let me finally get to the Episcopal Church in Guatemala. Well, I had two experiences. There's a big Episcopal church, well, big for the area, in the city of Quetzaltenango, which is known as Xela for short. Xela is Guatemala's second city. It's in the Western Highlands. It's kind of bohemian, intellectual. It's bookstores, a big market. Of course, I love it. And it had a campus of the Universidad de San Carlos, which is the national university. So I stayed there for a couple of weeks. It's surrounded by indigenous towns and villages because it's in the Western Highlands. So I stayed there for a couple of weeks and looked for the Episcopal Church on Sunday. There were some American visitors who attended, and also some well-dressed, well-off Guatemalans. So that first Sunday, the priest was very nice. He lived in the United States. It was a really nice church. And I was wearing a loose cotton dress that I bought at a mercado, a market, an open market in another town. It was a shift, basically. It reminded me of the muumuus that I used to wear in Hawaii. I used to teach at the University of Hawaii, and it had some embroidery here. And I wore that to church, and a very fashionably dressed Guatemalan woman said to me, with her face wrinkled up, "Only native women and tourists wear a dress like that." It was I actually can't remember whether she said that or whether she said Indian. In Guatemala, that's like the N-word. That is really a terrible thing to say. And the light bulb went off. I thought, oh yes, religion, class, identity, and how our church is seen, at least the big cathedrals. So in a completely different church experience, I was in a town along Lake Atitlan, which is heavily touristed, but up above Lake Atitlan there is the sort of state departamental capital, the market town of Solola, which is very indigenous. And the people of Solola, Guatemalans, Maya, have distinctive dress called traje. You can tell where people are from because it's kind of like a uniform. It's backstrap weaving done by women, and this is the Solola woman's, it's a huipil, it's a women's blouse. Like this is really distinctively Coban, even though it's not that traditional. So this is the Solola traje for women, and the idea is also with the skirts, they will tie a belt around it like this. This is also this magnificent. I went gaga over Guatemalan weaving, and the men wear this is wool. This is a Solola uniform bag. It's a man bag. The men wear it, and you'll see what the men's traje, the village, the district uniform is in Solola. You can see that woman there. She's got the huipil, the blouse in the red, and the skirt that's in tones of black. So I was looking for the church in Solola, and I had an address, and I went to the main square, and I looked down what appeared to be the street, which you'll notice is dirt. And I'm looking, there's a church? Well, that says Iglesia Episcopal Santa Maria Madre de Dios, Anglican Communion, una Santa Católica y Apostólica, one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So this is St. Mary, Mother of God, Episcopal Church. Doesn't really look like a church. Well, it gets better. So I'm standing, I said, are you kidding? What? And of course, I'm the only white person in the whole town. Well, this was the most heartwarming and wonderful and different church experience I have ever had. So I found the church, which turns out to be the use of a carport on Sundays, and you can see it's nicely decorated. And there's the man wearing the rhinestone cowboy Solala shirt. It's in the carport back of the street. The priest was Padre Antonio Cook, C-U-C, which is a Mayan name. It's an indigenous Mayan name. He made me chalice bearer and had me read a lesson in Spanish. And I say that because the people who were the congregants, there were maybe 12. And you can see this guy's got that one on a fantastic embroidered shirt. I mean, you got to put sunglasses on. This was the preparation of the place where we were going to have the altar. Padre Cook translated the liturgy on the fly into the indigenous language of Solala, which is Cachiquel. There are all these different Maya languages. So he's doing the liturgy in Cachiquel and translating it into Spanish for me, and in his sermon, and I mean, that was the most mind-blowing church experience. The thing is that these congregants were from a village outside of Solala, and that's the altar. When we finally got it set up, plastic chairs and a table, and he put the bread on the lid of a Tupperware container. That was the pattern, or the plate for the bread. But having him, the congregants were in full traje, full dress. Where are they? There they are. Wow. The congregation. And I realized that most of them were monolingual. The women and the children were monolingual in Cachiquel, so they didn't even speak Spanish. But the Solala men's traje has these magnificent woven pants, and that wool apron is all part of the costume. You know exactly where they come from. This is all made by women and black strap looms, which are, it's like a hammock thing. A woman kneels and gets the tension on the warp, woof, whatever, on the threads by kneeling and pulling back.
Whoa.
And weaves all of this stuff. It's the cheapest kind of a loom you could get. They sell them in the open markets. I don't know how they do it. I really don't know how they do it. So this is the Episcopal Church in Solala. But this is, for me, this was the church going to where the people are, and taking the church to where the people are. And it didn't matter that it was a carport. I actually put in here something that I copied in from my notes. Padre Cook told me these people are marginalized. I wasn't sure whether he meant these Maya peasants were marginalized because there was apparently a dispute going on in their village, a boundary dispute with a neighboring village of Tsutuhil speakers. It was kind of confusing. He said, and here's an interesting thing for the future of the church, in another city, Chichicastenango, they have a nice church with land around it, in other words, property. They used to have a big congregation when the diocese was funding all sorts of programs for the people, a water system, houses. But when the program stopped, the people stopped coming, and the church was reduced to 4 families. And he said that people really are not bound to churches by faith commitment, which is implications for these Pentecostal churches too. Let's see. What I was impressed with was the way that, first of all, this is an indigenous priest, and he tried to also incorporate Mayan spirituality and Maya religious practices, which still go on. It's very syncretic. Anyway, Maya rituals still do go on. And he made the service accessible to the illiterate, because I think out of the 12 people, only 3 or so, I had the sense that at least only about 3 were literate in Spanish. And I don't think there's much published in Cathedral. He used a Maya pottery incense burner, which is what they use in Maya rituals. They do rent that rather nice, they rent for their, what we would call a coffee hour, they rent from the landlord there's a nice little room in there that they can use on Sundays.
Would the priest be serving more than one congregation like that, or?
Not that I know of, actually.
No.
And they set it up, and at the end, they take it all down. This was one of the men put up his hat and his bag. And I thought, and this is out of my notes at the time, there is so much room there for aid projects. We're expanding ministry into things like Bible study and child feeding, religious education for the kids. The kids and the young people are the key. Padre Cook has a pickup, and I think someone drives the people back to their villages after the service. He seems like a wonderful priest. So actually what I meant to say was really what Canon Gwilym said. He kind of said what I was going to say, so you didn't really have to come. So,
I wasn't there when he was here.
oh, good then, okay. He said, what is the future of the church? What is the future of the Episcopal Church? And I take some lessons here. So I think that the future of the church isn't in white suburbia. Because just look at how most of those people voted. And the old rich families, you know, they're not supporting the Episcopal Church much. Okay, here's my ending is that I think the gospel and the example of Jesus point us toward the ministry to the poor and marginalized. It points us to a preferential option for the poor. I think that the storefront Pentecostal churches attract people in part just because they're there. They're on the street where people pass by. People can hear the service and they're curious and they can't miss those gigantic speakers blasting the music, which is typical. So maybe the U.S. Episcopal Church should do more to reach people where they are. Not to convert them, but to serve them, to be a missioner to the poor, to do what they are doing in San Pedro de Macorís, to do what Bishop Godfrey had people doing in Lima. And there's nothing wrong with going out in a van to people in the street, but a permanent presence, a storefront Episcopal church, sounds better. A place where people can stop by. It can be a place for prayer and consolation and for a chat and services of prayer that don't necessarily have to include the Eucharist. And I think this is a model that Paul gives us with the house churches of early Christianity, if you think about it. And maybe the liberation theologians were, in a way, trying to recreate that model of a small, tightly knit, mutually supportive spiritual community with the base communities. They had this idea of having comunidades de base, the base communities in villages. So the big hurdle, I think, that's all very well. We should do this. This is the gospel message. This is the Jesus way. And it all comes down to money in reality. And so I end with money or mission, how do we solve that one? I'm sorry, I took too long to talk. So talk amongst yourselves. Discuss. There, money or mission, discuss. And you know you're old when you remember that joke, you know. That's right. Or shawl, or all-purpose, again, made by a woman. And then this is how wide the loom is, and then they sew it together with thread.
It's different from our prayer shawls.
Huh?
It's a bit different from our prayer shawls.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, basic.
But it's your all-purpose carry-all, baby carrier.
One thing I noticed in all of the pictures that you showed, I didn't see any female in pants.
Well, that's true in Guatemala. You do in the capital city, but that's true. It's and in around the universities, the younger people do. The university students do. But in the rural areas and even in the towns, women wear skirts.
What was the structure of a diocese like? I was looking out for Bishop Godfrey, for instance.
Well, it is an Episcopal structure. I didn't really ask him a whole lot about that. He is the bishop, and presumably he's elected.
Guatemala has, I think, 2 or 3 bishops, and it's a province.
Yep.
And
Well,
so
the
there's
Southern Cone is a province now.
and Guatemala's in this. There's a Central American province
Yeah.
that Guatemala's part of. They
And
just-
Province 9 is the DR and Puerto Rico and some others.
And they just elected a new bishop who was serving in Massachusetts at St. Peter's in Salem. Silvestre Romero. He was just elected in May, so he's the new bishop in Guatemala.
It's quite a change.
Jocelyn, Bishop Godfrey is retired now. And my understanding was that he actually lived and was based in Trujillo, which is north of Lima. It's, like 8-9-hour drive. But obviously he spent a lot of time. When we were there in 2013, the last time, the new cathedral was not a big Gothic church. It was Buen Pastor Church, which is actually in Miraflores. And the English congregation was made up mostly of English speaking, obviously, but like foreign service, people who were there working with multinational corporations, et cetera, et cetera. There were a few Peruvian. I met one woman who was actually from North Carolina, who had married a Peruvian and had lived there ever since. So it's an interesting thing, but they had an Hispanic congregation that seemed to be a little bit more affluent, and we found Lima to be much more affluent in 2013 than we did in 1979.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, the whole city has completely changed, just completely changed. It's just we wouldn't have been able to find our way around. I mean, it was a completely new city. It's
Well, I
now,
was there in 2003 or something. So it was pretty affluent and.
Lima now has 7 million people.
40 miles long.
It's 40 miles long.
And you saw the sprawl.
The sprawl, and So what you have is you have people who are working in one of the downtown, you know, the central part, but they have an hour and a half bus ride to get in and out. But one of the interesting things that we saw, and our kids were remarking on this, the streets are full of people all the time. All the time. It was incredible. But the daughter of Bishop, the retired one, Godfrey, Rachel, is married to an American who is the priest at Buen Pastor. And I went down there to talk to them about daughters. And he was saying about having 2 chapters. He wouldn't even try to get them together because it's such a cultural thing, forget the language. But the Latino group seemed to have been much more affluent than the outside missions. They'd obviously,
Well, that's that seems to be the pattern.
yeah. But we heard, what I knew about the missions was that they were, you know, very poor, and it was primarily women. The ones that I knew about. They were having a lot of trouble with the guys who were drinking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.